We forget that things were not always the same way they are now. Wherever we are now, whatever we have, sometimes seems like that's all there is. But everything began somewhere. Our world has become a cacophony of noise and confusion. It is easy to forget from where we came. My name is Manuel C. Cruz, professor of theater arts. I have personally seen higher education devalue the arts, moving to professional business and technical education. Now, there's nothing wrong with these pathways, but we forget the value of the arts in our lives. Theater is important to our social and emotional learning. Theater can help people develop empathy, respect for others, and the ability to communicate effectively. It can also help people learn to behave in social situations. Theater helps build community. Theater brings people together in a shared space to experience something moving, funny, or thought-provoking. Theater is important to our sense of history. Theater can help people connect with history by making it come alive on stage. Theater can help with our creativity. It helps people tap into their own personal creativity, no matter what your profession is, and helps us understand the world. Theater can help people explore the world from different perspectives and understand people from other cultures. It can also help our academic achievement. Studies have suggested that students who are exposed to theater, music, and dance are more proficient in reading, writing, and math. Today we're going to talk about theatrical genre. Now, wherever theater has appeared, there has always been a tendency to divide it into categories or types, often referred to by the French term genre. Now, the English author Horace Walpole once wrote, "The world is a comedy to those that think, a tragedy to those that feel." The need for humans to categorize is a fundamental cognitive ability. We need to make sense of the world around us. We need to make sense of abstract thoughts. It also helps us to react quickly to things using prior knowledge and our personal prejudices. It's also a critical reasoning device. It helps us to develop new ideas from past ideas. The two original genres would be tragedy and comedy. These date back to ancient Greece and are represented by the two masks of Thalia and Melpomene. Thalia and Melpomene are two of the 9 muses whose parents include Zeus and the Greek goddess of memory, Mnemosyne. Now, during the Greek classical era, Thalia became the muse of comedy, while Melpomene became known as the muse of tragedy. Now, drama is one of the serious dramatic forms that include heroic drama, domestic drama, and melodrama. Now, what characterizes serious drama? Well, it's its thoughtful, sober attitude toward its subject. The audience must consider the material carefully, and the audience is emotionally involved in the passion and suffering of the characters. Tragedy asks the basic questions of human existence. Purpose, why am I here? Identity, who am I? Meaning, what is the point of all things? Destiny, where am I going? Do I have a choice? Free will, I do have a choice. Now, tragedy has 2 sub-genres. There's the traditional tragedy, and there is the modern tragedy. The 3 periods of traditional tragedy are Greece, 5th century BCE, that's Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides. England, late 16th century and early 17th century. That's Shakespeare, Marlowe, Kidd, Webster. And then the French Renaissance, which wasn't until the 17th century with Racine and Corneille. The modern tragic era would be late 19th century and continues on to the present day. Now, what characterizes the traditional tragedy? Well, it's heroes and heroines. They're extraordinary people. The kings, the queens, nobles. It all began with the gods during Greek and Roman theater. The circumstances of traditional tragedy are that the universe is determined to trap the hero or heroine in a fateful web. In fact, all tragedy, modern and traditional, just assumes that the universe is indifferent, even cruel and malevolent to all human concerns. Also, in traditional tragedy, it's irretrievable. There's a point in which there is no turning back. The character has to face his or her fate, and the tragic character will accept and face up to their fate. Now, the most important characteristic of traditional tragedy is its high language to address lofty concerns, its tragic verse. It's considered the only means by which such heights and depths of emotion can adequately be expressed. It also represents the extraordinary characters that utter this speech. They are highborn, they are lofty, and only the highborn, noble people would speak in such verse. If you ever really study Shakespeare, you would notice that only the noble people, the highborn, speak in verse, whereas the everyday people speak in prose. Now, there is a contradictory effect of both modern and traditional tragedy. It is the cruelty and corruption of the world versus the dignity of life and the beauty of art. Pessimism and optimism at the same time. Our heroes are destined for a tragic end. There's no going back from it. But they will face it with dignity and nobility, whether it is a traditional tragedy or a modern tragedy. Now, the modern tragedy is written in prose throughout, and the reason being is because our tragic heroes in modern tragedy are everyday people, everyday man. This new tragic view is based on modern society. As I said, at the end of the 18th century, with the rise of democracy and the fall of monarchy, the nobles, everyday man became represented in theater so that the audience could relate to what they were seeing on the stage. Now, modern tragedy asks the same questions. Why do people suffer? Why do violence and injustice exist? What is the meaning of our lives? Now, an offshoot of modern tragedy is heroic drama. Now, this is a serious drama with characteristics of the traditional tragedy with two exceptions. One, it has a happy ending. Everything turns out all right. And second, it has an optimistic worldview. There is no point of no return. The hero can be redeemed. Traditional Eastern theater often employs this technique. Now, with the rise of the bourgeoisie, that's the middle class, because before there was only upper class and lower class, we start to see a replacement of the heroic drama with domestic drama. Now, domestic indicates that the play is dealing with family or home. The bourgeois indicate characters that are of that middle, lower class that aspire to be upper class themselves, which is why these days when someone is acting, how shall we say, high tone, they often are referred to being as bougie. So the characters, being everyday people, are easily recognizable, often archetypes. The common themes include problems of society, struggles within the family, dashed hopes, and renewed determination to fulfill some sort of goal. Late in the 18th century, we see a new form rise in France. It is a genre that combines spoken recitation with short pieces of music. The word melodrama comes from the Greek word melos, which means song, and the French word drame, which means drama. Hence, the melodrama is born. The characteristics of which are, issues are clear-cut. There is a strong delineation of right and wrong. And the characters are clearly good and clearly bad. There's no guesswork involved in here. It usually speaks to our paranoia as well. There's exaggerated action, not exaggerated acting, which is often mistaken in the 21st century. These two things do not go hand in hand. There is danger on the edge of calamity with strong emphasis on the suspense of action. Melodrama is still one of the more popular forms of theater, both mediated and non-mediated, today. In the mid-20th century, the most popular form of melodrama in mediated theater was the Western. Gary Cooper, Alan Ladd, John Wayne. These guys all mostly played the good guy, the white hat. The guy that you didn't have to figure out, is he good, is he bad? He was very clearly the hero of the movie. And the black hat, the bad guy, was always easy to pick out. So it was melodrama. Also in the cinema, mediated theater is accompanied by some sort of soundtrack, music that will heighten the suspense, will heighten the drama, heighten the action. It will heighten the comedy, if there's comedy, but it was always accompanied by this music, this melody, this melodrama. Now, other forms of melodrama are science fiction movies, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, the Marvel movies, things like that. Horror movies, the Werewolf and Frankenstein, all the way up to Aliens and whatever science fiction horror that you could think of. Superhero films, as I said, all the Marvel movies are definitely melodrama. Also, to add onto this list would be any detective or spy movie, melodrama. Now, melodrama can also reflect the moral or political base of any society. Now, moving on to the comedy genre. Comedy is a humorous look at the world, and tragic comedy blends comic and tragedy together. That's modern tragedy. Now, the characteristics of comedy is the suspension of natural laws, going against what we would normally think as morality. It is best described by the Germans as Schadenfreude. This is the pleasure derived by someone from another person's misfortune. Comedy is at the expense of someone else's misery. Now, as an actor, I can tell you that comedy is much more challenging than drama. Being dramatic is like shooting fish in a barrel. The audience is much more easily swayed with a dramatic script. Being funny is much harder because you have to take accepted notions and turn them upside down so that people find it funny. Now, one of the older techniques of comedy is slapstick. You will know slapstick by its very physical comedy. It's a comic type that relies on ridiculous physical activities, often violent in nature for its humor. That's why much of the Bugs Bunny cartoons in the 21st century have been edited down, because it was a very severe slapstick comedy which is now being untaught in young people today. Now, the word slapstick is derived from the Commedia dell'arte, Arlecchino's club that he would often carry. It was a device that was made of two pieces of wood with a separator in the middle, and when you lightly tapped it on someone's back, it would make a slapping sound. The modern equivalent would be at sporting events when you have those hand-shaped clappers that you will shake to make noise. It is the same premise. The slapping together of the two objects make that slapping sound, and thus giving the name to the comedy, slapstick. As I said, this technique would be used in Commedia dell'arte, cartoons, and in silent movies where physical action was required to get the story across. The most obvious use of slapstick in modern theater, at least mediated theater that I have seen, is called the pratfall, other than the obvious physical comedy. The pratfall is when a character falls down for no apparent reason and is used for comic effect. Another technique of comedy is incongruity. Inappropriate behavior for specific circumstances causes our laughter. For example, if a character shows up to a black tie event in a powder blue tuxedo with ruffles on the shirt, that would be incongruity and would be something that we find funny. Verbal humor, such as the pun, is a humorous use of words with the same sound but different meaning. Aren't I a punny guy. The other one would be the malapropism. A malaprop is a word that sounds like the correct word but actually means something quite different. This was brought into the theater by a 1775 play called The Rivals with a character named Mrs. Malaprop, and she would always be saying inappropriate things. In the 70s, there was a television show, All in the Family, in which Archie Bunker would do the same thing. Things like, she is the pineapple of politeness instead of the pinnacle of politeness. This is an example of a malapropism. Another technique of comedy is discrepancy or incongruity in the way characters see themselves or pretend to be, as opposed to the way they actually are. Let's go back to the gentleman wearing the powder blue tuxedo. If he sees nothing wrong with it, if he thinks it is appropriate, this incongruity is what we find funny. And it's more than that just one event. It would be every event in his life, every event in the storyline in which he does something incongruous. Another technique of comedy would be plot complications or comedy of errors. This is where certain coincidences happen one after another, mistaken identities of characters within the plot line, and these errors start to pile up on each other and making the whole storyline funny. Now, comedy of errors can be considered not just a technique of comedy, but a form of comedy itself. There are many different forms of comedy. Comedy of errors is one of them. Thank you, Bill Shakespeare. Another form of comedy would be the farce. It uses exaggeration on multiple levels, emphasizing the exaggerated plot complications with few or no intellectual pretensions. It does not consider itself very serious. The qualities of mock violence and rapid movements and accelerated pace are what creates a farce. Now let's take our friend Will Ferrell. Very successful actor-comedian. He doesn't take himself very seriously, and it shows in his work. He has mastered all of the comic techniques: slapstick, verbal humor, comedy of character, comedy of errors, plot complication. This is what makes his movies so popular and funny. Way to go, Will Ferrell. Not the biggest fan, but I enjoy your work. Another form of comedy would be the burlesque. When people think about burlesque these days, they think of strip-teasers. Yes, the striptease was introduced in vaudeville to create burlesque, and the early burlesque shows were variety shows. A side note here is that the stripteasers never actually got naked. It was about the tease, not about the nudity. You have to remember that burlesque, like vaudeville, was a variety show in which people would do acts to entertain the crowd. And these acts were some sort of ludicrous comic imitation of dramatic forms, plays, literature, or other popular entertainment. They were just kind of poking fun, but they were using much more adult language, vulgarity, to get their point across, and that was the focus of the humor. Exaggerated acting, physical humor, and vulgarity. This is what defined the burlesque. The dancers were just kind of like the cherry on top of the ice cream here. Ice cream. Okay. So Harold Walpole said that the world is a comedy to those who think. Then satire, our next form of comedy, would be the pinnacle of comedy. Satire focuses on intellect and moral issues. It uses wit and irony and exaggeration to expose the evil and foolishness of mankind. It attacks and exposes the folly and vice of our world. And so satire would be just about any political comedian that you see or any comic that deals with the issues of today. Domestic comedy, as we've said before, deals with issues of family and home, and is often seen in situational comedy, although sometimes it is addressed in non-mediated theater and mediated theater in dramatic form. Popularized during the English Restoration is the comedy of manners. This focus on the foibles and peculiarities of the upper class. This is when you have a lower class individual interact with the upper class and the differences in their manners and acceptable behavior. A good example would be 1992's My Cousin Vinny, starring Joe Pesci and Marissa Tomei. Next, we have the comedy of ideas. This is comedy to debate intellectual propositions. It relies on verbal aspects of comedy rather than the physical comedy itself, although it may include some physical comedy. A prime example of modern film that utilizes comedy of ideas is 1993's Groundhog Day, starring Bill Murray. This is a movie where the central comic premise revolves around a cynical weatherman reliving the same day repeatedly, leading to philosophical questions about his personal growth, redemption, and the meaning of life. The third theatrical genre will be tragic comedy. This is a comic or ironic treatment of a very serious theme. This is where we blend together the comic and tragic forms into one script. The example of the classic tragic comedy would be Shakespeare's problem plays like Measure for Measure. In the modern era, a major playwright of tragic comedy would be Anton Chekhov, Uncle Vanya. Modern tragic comedy is sometimes conflated with absurdist drama, the avant-garde form, which suggests that laughter is the only response to man when he is faced with a tragic emptiness and meaninglessness of existence. The movement was started after World War II, and critic Martin Esslin coined the phrase theater of the absurd. These plays focus on the alienation of man and his plight within an illogical, unjust, ridiculous world. And the reason being is after World War II, there were a great many deaths around the world, and so life seemed to be absurd. Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot is one of the classic modern absurdist plays. It is a existential play recently reproduced on Broadway with Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen. The characteristics of absurdism are absurdist plots. They're illogical, often cyclical in nature and structure, and they lack any concrete beginning, middle, and end. They just exist, which is why, again, Waiting for Godot is existential play. As is the language. It's irrational as well, nonsensical, using non sequiturs, a train of thought that has no rational through line. Now, when I say that this play is existential, it has existential characters. They lack any history, specifically in the development of character. They just exist. They have no past. They have no future. They just are. And so that brings us to the end of the theatrical categories or theatrical genres. I'm Manuel C. Cruz. Thanks for tuning in. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, don't forget to hit the notification bell for future episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, please visit our Patreon page by clicking the link below.